Hey everyone. Today I want to talk a little bit about how we can trust the Bible. Yes, last video I brought that up. I brought up the interpretation and the translation of the Bible, and I want to touch a little bit more on that. I want to talk about the trustworthiness of it this time, though, as far as we pick up this book, and how do we know we can trust it? How do we know that what we're reading is reliable? And there's obviously several different levels that we can look at that from, and we'll take one today. This won't be a very long video. First of all, I want to look at it from the perspective of being an ancient document. So a lot of people, the criticism against the Bible is that it's such an old document. How do we trust it? How do we know that what we're reading is true? You know, how do we know it's not some myth, something made up, something contrived, you know, folklore, ancient tradition? How do we know we can trust that the events it describes actually happened? Okay, so let's take it from the standpoint of comparing it to other ancient literature. So the skeptic of the Bible is going to say, we can't trust it because it's, you know, it's ancient. We don't know. Nobody knows who actually wrote it. Nobody knows who penned each line or each chapter or book. It's by deductive reasoning that we figure out, you know, through study and comparisons and so forth, you know, who we think wrote it. Well, that's true. There's no doubt about that. And let me just preface this video by saying I'm going to go at this from the standpoint of a skeptic, you know, somebody who doesn't believe necessarily that the Bible was written or inspired by God or written by people who had the Spirit or however you want to phrase it. Because that kind of argument, if I try to use the argument that, well, the Bible's true and we can trust it because God wrote it, because He authored it, He inspired men who actually wrote the words down and so forth. Well, that may be the case, but that doesn't convince anybody, because that's circular reasoning. You can't say the Bible's trustworthy because it says it is. That doesn't work. So I'm going to go from the angle of just reason, just flat out logic and reason, and let's treat the Bible like we would treat any other ancient manuscript and see how it plays out. Okay, so doing that, let's say we have, let's look at other ancient manuscripts first. Let's take stuff like, the Code of Hammurabi. That wasn't a manuscript exactly. It was a tablet, but let's take stuff like that. This is things that are written down, whether etched in stone or on papyrus or whatever fashion we find them in. When we study those, we don't sit there and question, well, is this real? We don't sit there and say, well, yeah, we see this thing written on this cuneiform tablet and it's chiseled in, but we don't know that it actually is real. We don't know that it actually happened. We don't question it like that. I mean, yeah, the question is, could this be a myth? Could it be something? Sure. But as far as it being there, as far as it actually being somebody that actually did it, of course we don't question it. We don't question that somebody actually chiseled that in the stone. And the events that are recounted in these ancient manuscripts and such, we generally accept them as recording events that actually took place back then. Yeah, there's some myths, but it's pretty evident usually if it's a myth or not. If it's some maybe religious text or something that's more of a moral, like an epic myth, you can usually tell those in the old manuscripts. Well, we got to look at the Bible the same way. Some people are too biased against the Bible And some people are too biased in favor of the Bible too. It goes both ways. So we gotta figure out what's the most reasonable, most rational approach to the Bible. Well, if we see something written down, we have to assume that it was important enough to write down, for one thing. Especially back then, you didn't just you didn't have pen and paper readily available. You didn't have a keyboard and computer you could sit down and a printer. You could whip out, paragraphs at a time in just less than a minute. They didn't have that, so it took effort. It took a lot of time, and you had to have the means, the materials, to actually record anything back then. And along with that, a lot of people were not literate. A lot of times it was only the kind of the elite of society that were literate, that could read and write at all. So we got to take that into consideration. Things didn't get written down unless they were important, generally speaking. So that's something. That's not everything, but we got to take that into consideration and factor that in. Same with the Bible. Any of these manuscripts we have from the Bible, it must have been important for them to have gotten written down. Somebody thought they were very important. And even more so than a lot of other manuscripts, the Bible manuscripts, they were copied over and over. And I'm talking, well, let's just start. We can't treat them all together because that's not fair. Let's just start with the Old Testament manuscripts, and then we'll treat the New separately because they are in separate categories. But Old Testament first. These things were copied and recopied and recopied over and over and over again, and they were heavily studied, and they have traced generation to generation these copies. And so that's really important to think about. What other ancient manuscripts do we have that are like that? Very few, very few. And when we do have them, we trust them. We think that adds credibility to them. The fact that this society thought they were so important, and they thought they were accurate. That's another thing. We tend to think that we're pretty smart. We're in this modern age, this modern civilization with all this technology, and we got such big brains now, and those people back then were, less evolved, some people will say. That's totally contrary to the evidence. The evidence shows that these people were quite bright. In fact, very brilliant. And I'm not going to go into all the examples of that, but anybody who's studied it even a little bit can tell that these people were very, very intelligent, many of them. And yet they believed these things were accurate. They knew all about myth. They knew about truth. They knew about, literary style. It's actually very complex. The Old Testament, there are several different genres of literature in the Old Testament, and they're very distinct from one another. And they've got to be treated for what they are. And a lot of times what people do, what skeptics will do, or people that just aren't familiar with it, don't know any better, they treat everything the same. And they'll say, well, I don't believe in the Bible because, it talks about creation, say. We'll take Genesis, first 11 chapters of Genesis, for example. And they'll say, there's no way that could take place, the creation, how God created everything, the world, the trees, the mountains, the waters, the animals, people. It just couldn't happen. Or Noah's flood. Oh, there's no way the whole earth could be flooded by water. Where'd the water come from? And all these things. Okay. Granted, that seems really odd. It seems really bizarre for that to have happened historically, because it's nothing we see today. It's nothing we can test. It's not scientifically provable. And so it goes against our grain to believe that it really happened in any kind of literal fashion. So there's a couple ways to look at this. There's two arguments that can be made. There's more than that, but two main ones. And that is one, okay, and the traditional one is by Bible believers, or I should say by Bible literalists, maybe we'll say. And I don't mean that negatively. That's what I'm going to say, because that's what they do. They take everything as literal. And that's possible. It's very possible. And so they'll say, well, if God can create the world in general, then nothing is off the table. Anything's possible, right? So it seems silly to say God can create the world, but he can't flood it. That God can create the world, but he can't save Noah on an ark with, 2 of every kind of animal. Well, of course he can do that. If he creates the universe and the world, he can do whatever he wants inside that universe and that world, right? Okay, and that's a valid argument if that's the truth, if that's the case. So that argument is predicated on the notion that God did indeed create everything. Okay. Second way to look at it is, well, Genesis can very well be an allegory. It can be written there simply to connote some moral truth, to teach lessons. And that's very much in line with the way Near East people would write, and they still do today. But especially back then, they wrote much of their literature in allegory, hyperbole, metaphors galore. They used stories to get points across, fictional stories, to get a moral across. And we see that in many, many different civilizations. Look at the Native Americans. They did that all the time. And we see that with the Egyptians, the ancient Chinese, big time, Japanese, all of them. They tended to do that. We as Westerners don't do that so much, and so we think it's weird, and we don't generally go there automatically. It's more our knee-jerk reaction is to take everything literally and very linearly. We think very linearly and chronologically. Well, the Jews, we know for a fact, just from reading the Old Testament, we know the Jews did not think chronologically. That was not what was most important to them. What was most important to them, and you can find this, any Jewish scholar, any Hebrew scholar will tell you that the Hebrew people, they generally do not think chronologically. They think what's more important is topic. They think topically. So they'll put a bunch of events together, events that really took place, but they'll put them in together kind of out of chronological order and not worry about the sequence, because the idea that they're getting across is more important to them. And so they'll take something that happened, last year and put it in the same context as something that happened this year. But they won't tell you, they won't mention that, these were separated by, 11 or 12 months, these events. And so you'll read it thinking that they might have happened back to back, but they're not worried about that, because the point of it is what the event was, or what the two events meant together. So we got to understand that our looking at the scriptures from our 21st century Western view is problematic, because we're trying to get meaning from this, and we struggle because we don't have the same starting point as the Jews did, as the original hearers and readers of these messages. Same thing goes for the New Testament. I won't spend as much time on that right now, but New Testament, same thing. We're still talking. New Testament is very Jewish, mostly in literature. The early church was almost completely comprised of Jews. At the beginning, it was only Jews, and then that was for many years, actually. And then the Gentiles started coming in, and at the very end of the New Testament, really. And so most of the people in the church, most of the believers were Jews, no doubt about that. That doesn't get talked about enough, though, and I want to have another video on that specifically. But that makes a big difference when you realize that most everything that's written there was not only to Jews, but specifically for Jews. It was specifically written to Jews and a Jewish audience, and so that's why there's so much reliance on the Old Testament scriptures and so many references back there, so many quotes. I mean, it's just, the New Testament is replete with quotes from the Old Testament. And that makes sense, because they're appealing to the Old Covenant books and the law and the prophets. And so that makes a lot of sense. And it clears up a lot of things when you look at it that way. When you read the New Testament, realizing, wait a minute, this was written to Jewish Christians, by and large, everything starts to piece together and it starts to make so much more sense. Not that Gentiles were excluded, but that's just not who the focus audience was. Okay, I want to get back to my main point. So, New Testament, again, same thing. It was written with that flavor to it, though, that culture, and we got to keep that in mind. That we're reading a whole other culture from 2,000 years ago in the Near East, and we got to be thinking about that constantly. Every verse we read, we got to think of that context. Otherwise, we'll be off. Our chances of being right are so slim if we forget that one little thing. Okay, next point. A lot of skeptics about the Bible will say, well, the reason we can't really trust the reliability, the historical accuracy of the scriptures, of the manuscripts, is because it's religious in nature. And people who are religious tend to be biased. They'll be biased toward, the things that their God did, or their priesthood, or whatever religious affinity they have. They're going to be biased toward that, and so they're going to write it in a positive light, and and not denigrate their own deity. And I would say, yeah, you're right. That's true. That is a danger, and that's something you always have to be worried about in any context. People are biased. Everybody is biased, though, and that's what the skeptic doesn't always admit or doesn't think about, is everybody's biased. It doesn't matter whether you're religious or not. You have a bias. You have political biases. You have religious biases. Even if you're not religious, that's a bias too. And social, economic, you name it. You've got so many different angles to where you've got a certain perspective that you have, and it's not your fault, and it's actually a good thing, because our biases are what give us personality and range of thought. If we all thought the same way, it'd be a pretty boring world. So it's good that we have different perspectives, different points of view, but we just got to remember that we do. Everybody has them, and you can't get away from them. As much as we try to be objective, but we can't get away from our biases. But we can do better by acknowledging them as best we can and just being humble about it. Okay, so that can be a con of religion, of a religious writing, because there's a heavy bias there. Okay, but also it can be a pro in the sense that because it was a religious writing, it was held to so tightly, and it was carefully copied and recopied, and the reason it would be more carefully copied is because it was religious, because they thought it was the truth, and it was so important to them to copy it down correctly and get things just right, because in some points they felt that their salvation would depend upon it. So in that sense, you could say it was actually a strength that it's a religious writing, because they felt so motivated to keep it pure, keep it right, keep it true, keep it accurate, even more so than any other secular document. If you're writing about some historical event that happened in a marketplace somewhere back in 400 BC or whatever, the accuracy of that, it's you want to be accurate, but you're not going to go through great pains to make sure every little letter, every jot and tittle, so to speak, is correct. But you would if it's religious, and so that can be a pro. So we just got to remember that when we're talking about writing. We got to be fair. That's all I'm saying. On both sides, we have to be fair. We have to admit when there are issues, and we have to admit when it makes sense to acknowledge that it's probably accurate, and there's no reason to doubt it. One other thing about the Bible, and I'm not trying to prove the Bible's authenticity or anything here. I want to give it a fair shot. I want to give it fair criticism. I don't want to write it off without proper grounds nor do I want to accept it without proper grounds. That's important. We want to try to be as objective as we can with this. So one of the things we test manuscripts against is other manuscripts, other secular writings. Do the events described in, like, again, we're in the Old Testament here. Well, New too. We'll take both Testaments. Do the events describe, or excuse me, do the manuscripts describe events that have backing from other secular writings, from writings of other civilizations? And the Bible definitely does. There's no doubt about that. It's replete with corroborating evidence from other civilizations, other writings. And there's no doubt about that. And even historical records, even things we have today, even excavations we make today are, in a lot of cases, are actually proving the Bible to be accurate, at least in little parts of it, things that were said. I mean, just off the top of my head, one example was the Hittite civilization. That's a big deal, and that doesn't get enough credit. All the skeptic scholars would say, no, the Bible is inaccurate because it talks about this Hittite civilization, and it never existed. There's no evidence for the civilization, and yet the Bible talks about it in so many different places in the Old Testament. And for many, many years, that was a sticking point. It is almost held up by the secular community as a great prize that they have this Hittite civilization that they can use against the validity of the Bible. Well, lo and behold, excavations were going on, and they come across this city, and they excavate this site and find out, whoa, this is talking about the Hittite civilization. And here, nobody had known about the Hittites for who knows how many years, hundreds, thousands of years. Nobody had known about them, but the Bible talked about them. And here, come to find out, they really did exist. And there's evidence in the ground that the Hittite civilization exists. I'm going to speed up my walk here. I got to get back, take my son to orientation here. So there we go. That's a huge thing. That actually was a big proof that at least part of the Bible was legitimate, that these were written by real people about real civilizations that existed at the time. Now, does that mean everything is accurate? No, it doesn't. But it's one more piece of the puzzle, one more piece of evidence that points toward historical accuracy. And we can't use that and take it as a blanket statement and spread that across the whole Bible. That wouldn't be responsible, but it's a piece, and it helps. Because if it was found out that they did for sure never exist, that would be a piece against the Bible. But now it's for it. So anyway, that's just one thing. But there are others like that too. Other things that the Bible talks about that we didn't even know until much later, like until science caught up and we could figure out some of these things we didn't know. But that's it for another topic. I just want to throw out that example because it is off the top of my head. Another criticism made against the Bible is that it's not reasonable to believe the Bible because of the actual events that are, that it claims took place. The sequence of events. It says, no, it contradicts in certain areas. There are too many contradictions in the Bible. So it's not accurate. It's not historically accurate. It's not reliable because it contradicts itself, and there's too many conflicts with itself. And they'll point out different details. And I don't disagree that you read these passages, and it looks like, yeah, man, it says that this happened in this passage, but then over here it says like the exact opposite happened, or something different. Like a number is different. Like this place it said there were 300 warriors, and over here it says there were 1,000 warriors in the same battle, same event, or whatever it was. And I agree. Morning.
What you up to there?
Oh, I'm just making a video.
Oh, okay. Sorry to interrupt you.
No problem.
Have a good one.
You too. Yeah, so I agree that seems very odd. How could it be trustworthy and reliable if the numbers don't match, or if one guy was said to have done this and another verse that says a different guy did that very thing. It seems to be contradiction. And so there's a couple ways to look at that. How do we as Bible believers rationalize that? And it's not a good idea to write it off, and it's not a good idea to explain it away or to try to make it fit. We can't make it fit. That's not fair. We can't do mental and literary gymnastics to make it work. So we got to treat it honestly. And how do we do that? Well, there's a number of ways that can be reasoned out. But before I go there, I want to mention some other issues here. You know, the other argument on the other side is that it's too perfect. They'll say, well, it's just too much like a story that goes through, and it's too perfect to be real history. History just doesn't play out that perfectly. Because it's like everything starts at the beginning and ends at the end, and it's like it's wrapped up with a bow at the end, and everything is just right, and there's a story that you can follow all the way through, and they say because of that, it's not realistic. It's too much like somebody just wrote a story, and they wrote what they wanted to write, and they wanted it to be a perfect story, so they wrote a perfect story with a perfect happy ending and all that. And so that's another criticism. So that's another thing we'll talk about. Let's talk about that first. So, is it really that perfect? In my mind, this is actually one of its strengths, because it's not perfect by any means. You look at the very beginning, Adam and Eve. You got the first man that was created, then you have Eve that was created after him, and then she is the one that eats from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Yeah, what are we told in the Bible? We're told Adam takes the brunt of the blame. Now, to me, that doesn't sound like a perfect story. That doesn't sound like something the Jewish people, as proud as they're very proud people, not in a bad sense, just proud of their lineage and their heritage. Why would they maintain that Adam was to blame for Eve taking the fall? That doesn't make sense. That's illogical. That's not something somebody write in a story. I'm not saying that's proof or anything. I'm just saying that's just one of the many points that are like this. But that's a big one, because especially back in that time where Jewish male leadership was so prevalent, and women really had no rights. They were kind of like property. I think that's overemphasized or over exaggerated sometimes how exactly that worked. But it was the case. They were definitely secondary in status in their society. And for them to say that because the woman sinned, the man gets the blame, that just doesn't make sense. That's totally counterintuitive to their culture. Okay, I gotta take a break here. I'll come back in just a bit. Okay, sorry about that. I had to take my son to freshman orientation. So just gonna finish up the video real quick about, we were talking about how the Bible, it's some people say it's too perfect, so it doesn't make sense. It's not rational to believe it because it sounds like a story. And I was starting to make the case that, well, there are a lot of points in the Bible that are not rational in that sense. They wouldn't make a good story. Generally in a good story, you don't point out your hero's faults. You don't point out the parts that you would be embarrassed of as a culture. And there are many things in the Bible where the Jews would be very embarrassed of how some of their prominent characters and their protagonists should have handled things, and they didn't. I mentioned Adam and Eve. That was just one part of the story. That's very unnatural to have a story like that. Another one would be Abraham. Abram came from a pagan nation. Complete idolatry, complete paganism. And God chose him. Not because he believed in God, but because he had the right heart. appears is because of his character, and God chose him to make a nation out of his family, his bloodline. And so that's not a typical thing that would be done in a culture like that, because that's not something that they would be proud of. Another one would be Jacob. Look at how Jacob and the nation of Israel came to be. It was founded on deceit, lying, trickery. Look how Jacob he bribed his brother to get the birthright. He lied to his father to get the blessing. And that's how the whole nation of Israel started. It was all founded upon Jacob, whose name was turned into Israel. And here he got that blessing, that birthright, through deceit and cunning and lying. That's not something to be proud of. So that's another big thing that would not be a natural thing for people like the Jews to put in there arbitrarily, to make up, to invent. That speaks very heavily against the notion that it's just a contrived story. So anyway, and there are others, many others actually like that. King David, look at what he did. He created one of the worst offenses known to man, just about. Stealing someone's wife, having an affair, and then killing the husband to kind of get rid of the problem. That's terrible, absolutely horrible. And yet, David is one of the key figures in the entire Bible story, especially as you get to the New Testament, because he is the descendant of Jesus, and it's his throne on whom Jesus is said to reign. And so, anyway, another instance. And those are just a handful, some of the more prominent ones, but there are many more going through the scriptures. So that, to me, that is enough evidence, though, to say that, well, it's not just a made-up story. It's not so neat and fits so perfectly, and that we can just write it off as being too good to be true. Definitely not that. So anyway, those are just some of my thoughts. Again, I want to make this video short today, but I just want to put those out there, see what you guys think about that. Please let me know, give me some feedback on what you think. I'm trying to be neutral. I mean, obviously I have my own bias, but I'm trying to present a neutral approach, because I have a lot to learn. I know I do have biases, and I'd like to learn from some other people and their biases. You know, some biases are good, some are bad. And maybe together we can come to some good conclusions here. All right, so that'll wrap up this one. Again, short, brief comments, please, and I'll try to take them one at a time and see what I can do. I'll incorporate them into future videos, see what you guys want to talk about, what subjects do you guys want to talk about, and we'll see where we go. All right, that's it for now. We will see you next time.